The wind tore across the open fields, cutting through the thin layers of clothing with merciless precision. In the distance, the skeletal outlines of forests swayed under the weight of frost, and rivers had long since frozen solid, their surfaces gleaming like sheets of iron beneath the pale winter sun. At the heart of this frozen landscape, a small, unremarkable structure stood, barely distinguishable from the surrounding earth, a humble hut of mud, sticks, and straw. Inside, an entire family huddled together, seeking warmth, not out of comfort, but sheer necessity. Smoke from a meager fire curled upward through gaps in the thatched roof, stinging eyes and lungs alike, yet offering the only barrier between them and the cold that threatened to consume everything alive. This was not an isolated scene. Across Europe, Asia, and parts of the Middle East, millions of peasants faced winters that could break armies, silence kings, and topple empires, while monarchs dined by candlelight in stone castles, insulated and heated. The ordinary people endured freezing nights on the bare floors of huts that seemed incapable of keeping out the wind. Their survival depended on knowledge passed down through generations, on rituals of storage, on clever but often desperate ways to endure hunger, frostbite, and disease. These were the invisible battles, fought not with swords or armies, but with patience, ingenuity, and sheer resilience. Long before the rise of kingdoms and empires, human settlements were dictated by necessity. Early agricultural communities learned quickly that survival through winter was more than a matter of food. It was a question of shelter, of understanding the rhythm of nature, and of making the most of scarce resources. Wattle and daub walls, simple timber frames, and thatched roofs were not merely architectural choices, they were lifelines. Every inch of clay packed into a wall, every layer of straw carefully woven into the roof, represented a calculated effort to keep the cold at bay. Generations of experience transformed rudimentary mud huts into fragile yet effective sanctuaries, capable of sustaining life even under the harshest conditions. Yet survival was precarious. Winters were long, unpredictable, and often cruel beyond measure. Crops stored in granaries could spoil or be eaten by vermin. Rivers froze, making transport and trade impossible. Firewood dwindled, leaving families to ration warmth with painful precision. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, and sickness could spread through a village faster than the snow drifted across the fields. And still, through centuries of hardship, peasants endured. They endured because they had no choice, because the land offered no mercy, and because humanity's instinct to survive is stronger than any storm. The endurance of these ordinary people was often overshadowed by the grandeur of empires and the exploits of kings. But without them, civilization itself could not have survived. In every winter that swept through medieval Europe, in every bitter cold that blanketed the plains of Asia, peasants faced the same fundamental challenge: how to live with almost nothing, with frozen earth as walls, straw as insulation, and fire as the sole guardian against the encroaching cold. Their lives were defined by this struggle, and every survival was a small victory against forces far larger than themselves. Yet even within this relentless cycle of cold and hunger, moments of ingenuity and resilience appeared. Families learned to sleep huddled together, to conserve warmth, to burn dung or dried reeds when firewood was scarce, and to hide secret caches of food buried beneath the frozen earth. Communities shared knowledge, resources, and stories, weaving networks of survival that would carry them through years of scarcity. What began as basic survival techniques evolved into cultural practices, shaping how villages lived, celebrated, and endured. Even the most brutal winters could not erase the collective wisdom embedded in mud walls and thatched roofs. The story of peasants enduring winters with nothing but mud huts is not merely a tale of suffering. It is a testament to human resilience and adaptability. It is a reminder that history is not solely the domain of kings and conquerors, but also of the millions of ordinary people whose daily battles against the elements shaped the course of civilization. And as the cold wind continued to howl across the fields, one cannot help but wonder, how did they manage to survive year after year when the world itself seemed determined to see them fail? That question leads us into the heart of a story of endurance, ingenuity, and the unyielding human spirit that no winter could ever of kingdoms, empires, and structured armies. Human survival was dictated by the rhythms of nature. The earliest Neolithic villages, scattered across fertile river valleys, were modest in appearance but monumental in their significance. Here, humanity took its first tentative steps away from nomadic hunting and gathering, settling into small communities where survival became a shared struggle against the elements. These early settlers constructed Watalandab huts, simple frameworks of woven branches coated with mud and clay. To the modern eye, these dwellings might appear fragile, almost laughably insufficient against the forces of winter, but for the people of the time, they represented the thin line between life and death. The choice to settle and build such structures was not made lightly. Each mud wall required laborious effort, from harvesting suitable branches to gathering clay-rich soil, mixing it with water, and applying it to the framework. Families worked together, often for weeks, to erect a single dwelling, and the survival of each household depended upon the stability of these walls. Even so, winter presented a constant, unrelenting threat. The huts offered rudimentary protection from wind and predators, but every crack, every imperfect seam, allowed the cold to seep in. Frost crept across floors at night, and the simple hearth in the center of the home was the sole source of warmth. Smoke lingered inside the walls, choking lungs. Yet it was better than the icy grasp of the night air. Survival in these villages demanded more than just building walls. It required foresight, planning, and a deep understanding of the environment. Food had to be stored carefully, often buried in cool, insulated pits beneath the earth, protected from animals and early spoilage. Harvested grains, nuts, and tubers were meticulously rationed, ensuring that the lean months would not decimate the community. Firewood was gathered in painstaking quantities during the warmer months, stacked in protective shelters to prevent dampness and rot. Each task carried a sense of urgency. Failure meant exposure to starvation or freezing. The rhythms of life were dictated not by sunlight or religious observance, but by the seasons and the pressing need to survive until spring returned. Even the act of staying alive shaped social structures and daily routines. Families and neighbors formed cooperative systems, sharing labor, food, and knowledge. Younger members were taught from an early age to recognize edible plants, to preserve food, and to maintain the structural integrity of their homes. Elders passed down oral traditions of survival, explaining which areas offered the best shelter from winter winds, which storage methods preserved grains longest, and which fires burned longest without consuming the meager resources of the household. Each hut, each wall, each carefully stored bundle of food became a repository of collective wisdom. Yet life was far from certain. Winter was merciless, and the slightest miscalculation could be fatal. A poorly packed mud wall might crumble under frost. A wet or rotted pile of firewood might fail to provide warmth on the coldest nights. Even with the best preparation, hunger gnawed at bellies as food ran low, and frostbitten limbs reminded every villager of their vulnerability. These early communities learned resilience out of necessity, developing strategies not for comfort, but for survival. The emergence of wattle and daub huts marked the beginning of a long human journey. The struggle to endure winter with limited means. The fight to preserve life against nature's relentless cycles. In these early Neolithic settlements, peasants, though they were not yet called that, faced the harsh reality of the seasons, each year testing their ability to adapt, endure, and survive. The foundations of human resilience were laid here, in the mud, the straw, and the firelit shadows of primitive dwellings. It was a rhythm that would echo across millennia, generations of ordinary people building walls, storing food, tending fires, and confronting the cold, year after year. Long before kings and empires would enter the story, from these first mud walls, a pattern emerged, a template for survival that would endure in countless variations across the world. These huts were more than shelters. They were sanctuaries, laboratories of adaptation, and monuments to human ingenuity. The lessons learned in the harsh winters of these early settlements would ripple through time, shaping the strategies, structures, and communal practices of every peasant community that followed. The first mud walls of civilization were humble, but they bore witness to the indomitable will of humans to endure, even when the cold threatened to consume them entirely. In the shadow of these fragile walls, the seeds of a relentless struggle were sown, the battle between humanity and the seasons. Even as the first frost-etched patterns on fragile rooftops and winds tore through unsealed gaps, these early villagers endured. They were the first to learn that survival required more than strength. It required foresight, collaboration, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to the harsh, unyielding grip of winter. And in their endurance, history began its long, quiet record of ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship, their mud walls standing as silent witnesses to the human spirit's earliest triumphs. Villages evolved into early agrarian societies. The rhythms of survival became more complex, but the struggle against winter remained just as brutal. By the medieval period, much of Europe was divided into fiefdoms and manors, with peasants working the land under the authority of lords, barons, and kings. Their homes, modest by any standard, were typically one-room huts constructed of mud, timber, and thatch. These simple dwellings, often no larger than a modern living room, had little insulation beyond the packed earth walls, and gaps in the construction allowed the bitter winter winds to creep inside. In these huts, families huddled together, relying on a central hearth not only for warmth but for cooking and light, smoke curling endlessly toward thatched roofs in a constant battle between fire and suffocating fumes. The life of a medieval peasant was dictated by necessity and constraint. Food storage and preparation were critical to survival, and the winter months tested ingenuity at every turn. Salting and drying meat became an essential skill, as fresh protein could not last the season. Grains were harvested and stored in earthen or wooden silos, often kept within the hut to prevent theft or spoilage. Yet the proximity of stored food could invite rodents and other vermin. Root vegetables were buried beneath layers of straw or sand to preserve them through the frost, a delicate balance between protection and access. Even with these precautions, many families faced hunger, forced to ration meals to a fraction of what summer provided. Each day was a careful calculation, balancing sustenance, warmth, and the limited fuel that could keep a fire burning for more than a few hours. The central fire was both a lifeline and a hazard. Thick smoke filled the hut, obscuring vision, stinging eyes, and choking lungs, yet it kept frostbite at bay, offering a fragile sense of protection. Families learned to manage this delicate equilibrium, arranging their sleeping positions around the hearth, layering themselves in straw, wool, or animal hides, and breathing shallowly to avoid smoke inhalation. Every habit was comfort was an impossibility, and every choice carried weighty consequences. One miscalculation, a sudden gust of wind, a collapse of the thatch roof under heavy snow, or a fire that burned to low could mean death in the freezing darkness. Meanwhile, just beyond the humble fields and mud walls, the lords and their households lived in stark contrast. Stone castles and manor houses offered insulation, fuel, and abundant food. Kitchens overflowed with salted hams, stews, and preserved fruits. Windows, often glazed or shuttered, kept out the biting wind. Winter for the nobility was a time of feasts and festivities, of warmth and abundance, while the peasant world endured constant vigilance against starvation and cold. Yet the peasant's toil was essential for this disparity. Their labor in the fields, in forests, and in the villages supplied the very wealth that insulated the elite from the harsh rhythms of nature. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been more acute. While lords celebrated warmth, fire, and abundance, peasants prayed that their mud huts would withstand the snow and that their meager stores of food would last until spring. The true test of peasant resilience came with the onset of the Little Ice Age, a prolonged climatic downturn that gripped Europe from roughly the 14th to the 19th centuries. Winters grew longer and harsher, rivers froze solid for months, and snowfall accumulated to levels that crushed the poorly reinforced roofs of many huts. Crops failed with alarming frequency, and famines swept across regions that had once been fertile and productive. The cycle of planting, harvesting, and surviving through winter became increasingly precarious, with the margin for error shrinking to almost nothing. Villagers faced the compounding effects of cold, scarcity, and disease, each intensifying the other in a relentless spiral of hardship. During the coldest winters, entire communities relied on ingenuity to survive. Straw and rushes were layered on floors to conserve heat, and shared walls provided collective insulation. Families huddled together for warmth, sleeping in shifts if the fire could not sustain the entire household at once. Food caches were meticulously hidden to prevent theft, while some villages developed underground storage pits, cleverly insulated with earth and straw, where root vegetables and grains could endure months of frost. Smoke was tolerated as a constant companion. Soot-blackened walls testified to years of battling winter, as families endured the choking fumes night after night. Even in these primitive dwellings, adaptations emerged that reflected a deep understanding of seasonal cycles, a testament to the accumulated wisdom of generations. Yet the Little Ice Age was not simply an environmental challenge. It reshaped society itself. Famine and scarcity increased the vulnerability of peasant communities to disease, including periodic outbreaks of plague, which often accompanied poor nutrition and crowded, smoky living conditions. In many regions, mortality rates soared during the coldest years, with entire families wiped out and villages abandoned. Social tensions grew as the inequities between lords and peasants became more pronounced. Peasants were compelled to pay taxes and provide labor even as their survival became ever more uncertain. The rhythm of the seasons dictated life and death, and the ability to endure winter determined the very continuity of communities. Religious and cultural practices emerged in response to these hardships. Feasts and festivals, timed around the winter solstice or midwinter celebrations, offered moments of communal warmth, both literal and spiritual. These events were brief reprieves from the harsh reality, providing food, song, and solidarity. Villagers also developed superstitions and rituals intended to protect against the harshness of the season. Charms to preserve crops, prayers for fire and warmth, and oral traditions that carried survival wisdom across generations. Even within the simplest mud huts, these cultural practices reflected the human need to find hope and meaning in the midst of relentless adversity. Despite these measures, winters were merciless. Snowdrifts could collapse poorly thatched roofs, leaving families exposed to deadly cold. Fires could fail, and stored food could spoil or be stolen. Children and the elderly, the most vulnerable, often bore the brunt of scarcity, succumbing to exposure or hunger when others survived. Yet, year after year, peasants endured. Their survival was not heroic in the sense of glory or conquest, but in quiet, persistent adaptation to conditions that were far beyond individual control. Each winter was a crucible, testing the ingenuity, endurance, and resilience of those who lived in the mud huts scattered across feudal fields. The Little Ice Age, while a catastrophe for many, also catalyzed the refinement of peasant survival techniques. Communities became increasingly resourceful, learning to stockpile more efficiently, to insulate their huts better, and to maintain essential fires longer. They developed barter networks and communal strategies for sharing food and firewood. Even under extreme duress, the rhythm of labor, care, and survival persisted. Peasants learned that endurance required cooperation, foresight, and a relentless commitment to protecting life against the relentless cycles of nature. In the broader sweep of history, these one-room mud huts, smothered in smoke and frost, were as crucial as the stone castles of lords. They were laboratories of resilience, arenas in which generations learned to survive under the harshest conditions. Their endurance laid the foundation for the agricultural stability necessary for the eventual rise of larger societies, towns, and cities. The simple acts of gathering firewood, preserving grains, and huddling close by a fire represented an extraordinary struggle against the environment. A struggle that continued even as the world around them became more politically complex. Peasants lived within this tension between vulnerability and ingenuity. The weight of survival rested on their shoulders, often unseen and unrecorded in the annals of history. Yet their resilience shaped the very fabric of medieval life. Mud walls and thatched roofs, smoke-filled interiors, and bitter nights were the stage on which countless generations of ordinary people confronted extraordinary challenges. Each winter was a test of knowledge, preparation, and endurance. Each spring a fragile triumph over adversity. As the Little Ice Age continued to grip Europe, the contrast between the warmth of noble castles and the harsh reality of peasant life became ever more stark. Yet, the persistence of these communities, year after year, winter after winter, demonstrated the remarkable capacity of humans to adapt, endure, and survive even when the elements seemed insurmountable. In the cold, smoke-filled huts of medieval Europe, the rhythm of life had settled into a pattern that would persist for centuries. Labor, endurance, and survival, measured against the unrelenting weight of winter. Through these struggles, peasants developed strategies that transcended generations, establishing practices and knowledge that would inform rural life for centuries. From the careful rationing of food to the construction techniques that reinforced mud walls against snow, each adaptation reflected a nuanced understanding of survival. In enduring the Little Ice Age, peasants became not only survivors of nature's harshest winters, but architects of the quiet resilience that allowed Europe to eventually emerge from its frozen trials. Their story is one of ordinary people confronting extraordinary hardship, living each day under the oppressive weight of cold. Between the 14th and 17th marked a turning point in the history of European winters. What had once been harsh and testing became merciless. As temperatures plunged and climates shifted during a period historians now call the Little Ice Age, Europe froze. Rivers that had carried boats and sustained towns froze solid, their surfaces cracked and glazed with ice that reflected a pale, unrelenting sun. Fields lay buried beneath snowdrifts, sometimes for months on end, and the crops that once promised life turned to failure, leaving communities exposed to hunger, disease, and death. For the peasantry, whose lives were intimately tied to the rhythm of the seasons, these were not simply difficult winters, they were existential crises. Mud huts, already fragile and barely insulated, became prisons rather than sanctuaries. Walls thick with earth and straw offered only limited resistance to frost, and roofs of thatch, sagging under heavy snow, threatened collapse. Families huddled together for warmth, their bodies pressed against one another, seeking shared heat. In rooms where smoke from the central hearth was thick enough to burn eyes and choke lungs, the fire itself was precious, rationed carefully so it would last through the longest nights, and tended as though it were a sacred guardian against death. Even the simplest misstep, a sudden gust blowing a hole in a roof, a hearth that smoldered too low, or the unexpected collapse of stored food could turn a household into a scene of tragedy. Survival demanded ingenuity and discipline. Food, already limited in quantity, had to be rationed to the smallest possible portions. Grains, roots, and dried legumes were measured carefully, calculated to provide the maximum sustenance for the longest period. Families learned to stretch small quantities into palatable meals, boiling roots, grinding grains, and turning even the smallest scraps into soup or porridge. Water had to be melted from ice or drawn from wells, often frozen solid for weeks, forcing villagers to rely on snow or small trickles from streams. Every act of daily survival was an exercise in planning, endurance, and foresight, as the margin for error was non-existent. The cold did more than freeze rivers and kill crops. It changed the very texture of life. Roads and pathways, once reliable, became treacherous sheets of ice. Communication between villages slowed, isolating communities and increasing their vulnerability. Disease followed in the wake of hunger and frostbite, spreading more quickly in overcrowded huts where families slept together to conserve heat. Infants, the elderly, and the infirm were especially at risk, and mortality rates soared. Records from parish registers of the time reveal staggering numbers of deaths in the coldest winters, with entire families succumbing in some regions. Those who survived did so not by luck alone, but by a blend of knowledge, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower. Peasant resilience during this era became legendary. It was a form of endurance that demanded continuous adaptation to a hostile environment. People learned to use every resource available: dung and dry reeds for fuel when wood ran out, straw and animal hides as insulation, and underground pits to store roots and grains safely from frost and vermin. Communities often shared resources, burning fires communally or rotating food and water to ensure that everyone survived. These networks of survival were as vital as the structures themselves, as no family could endure such winters entirely alone. The ingenuity developed in these years conserving heat, rationing food, and improvising with meager materials would be passed down through generations, forming the backbone of peasant knowledge for centuries. Yet survival was never guaranteed. Entire communities perished when snow blocked paths to essential resources, when stored food spoiled, or when illness swept unchecked through overcrowded huts. Famines became a recurring reality, sometimes wiping out significant portions of the population. The infamous famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, struck northern Europe following a series of unusually harsh winters and torrential rains that destroyed crops. Millions died, and the trauma was compounded by the inability of medieval infrastructure to respond effectively. Mud huts that had once provided shelter became death traps, their walls failing under the weight of snow, their small fires inadequate to stave off frostbite, and their inhabitants weakened by hunger. Historical records and archaeological findings illustrate the stark contrast between the lives of peasants and those of the nobility during this period. Castles and manors, insulated with stone walls and heated by large fireplaces, offered warmth and abundant food even when famine and cold struck nearby villages. Nobles maintained access to preserved meat, imported grains, and stored firewood, effectively buffering themselves against the harshness of nature. Meanwhile, peasants were forced to survive with nothing but earth and fire, their daily existence a constant negotiation with mortality. Yet, despite the inequity and brutality of circumstance, the ability of the peasantry to endure these winters forged resilience that would define rural life for generations. The psychological weight of survival under such relentless conditions cannot be overstated. Living in near constant cold, watching children weaken from hunger, and confronting the ever-present risk of roof collapse or illness-shaped communities in profound ways, folklore and religious practice became intertwined with survival. Families prayed for divine protection against frost, famine, and disease, often placing symbolic charms in walls or around homes to guard against misfortune. Rituals surrounding midwinter celebrations, whether Christian, pagan, or localized, served not only as spiritual observances, but as collective attempts to impose order, hope, and endurance onto an otherwise merciless environment. Despite ingenuity, the mortality rate during these centuries was staggering. The combination of harsh winters, failed crops, and disease created cycles of population decline that could take decades to recover. Archaeological evidence shows that settlements often shifted or were abandoned entirely after successive catastrophic winters. Peasant communities faced the unrelenting choice of risk or adaptation: stay in increasingly dangerous dwellings, move to marginal lands with uncertain resources, or die. Those who survived developed habits and practices that became cultural touchstones: methods of preserving food, communal sleeping arrangements to maximize heat, and the strategic use of every building material to maintain warmth and shelter. The Little Ice Age also reshaped economic and social structures. As harvests failed, food prices soared, labor shortages increased, and social unrest became more common. Peasants, already burdened with taxes and obligations to their lords, found themselves in an ever-tightening grip of necessity and authority. Revolts and migrations were sometimes prompted by the pressures of winter famine, highlighting the connection between climate, survival, and social stability. In many ways, the extreme cold of these centuries tested not only human endurance, but also the resilience of medieval society itself, exposing vulnerabilities in governance, infrastructure, and communal support systems. Yet even in the face of relentless hardship, innovation persisted. Families learned to optimize the small spaces of their huts, constructing sleeping platforms layered with straw, rearranging hearths for maximum warmth, and developing techniques for insulating walls. With mud, clay, and animal dung, firewood was carefully harvested, dried, and rationed, with every branch accounted for. Villages created informal relief networks, sharing what little they could spare to keep as many members alive as possible. Children were taught survival skills from an early age, ensuring that knowledge of preparation, rationing, and endurance passed from one generation to the next. In this crucible of cold and scarcity, human ingenuity and adaptability reached extraordinary heights. The physical toll of these winters was immense. Frostbite, malnutrition, and respiratory illness were constant companions. People adapted by layering clothing, often crafted from wool, leather, or animal hides, and by developing techniques to preserve body heat during long nights. Communal sleeping arrangements became a necessity, with entire families huddled together, sharing warmth, and minimizing exposure to icy air. In the harshest periods, even these measures were not enough, and survival depended on the most careful planning, foresight, and luck. Not all endured. Countless villages disappeared from maps, their populations decimated by a combination of weather, famine, and disease. Yet those who survived carried forward a legacy of resilience that would inform the very structure of rural life for centuries. Mud huts, primitive as they were, became laboratories of survival, teaching lessons about human ingenuity, communal effort, and the capacity to endure conditions that seemed beyond human tolerance. These structures and the practices associated with them became the backbone of peasant life, demonstrating that survival was not solely a matter of resources, but of knowledge, adaptation, and unyielding determination. By the 17th century, the experience of surviving prolonged, deadly winters had transformed the peasantry in profound ways. Communities had developed cultural, practical, and social mechanisms for enduring scarcity and cold. These strategies ranged from advanced food storage to architectural innovations, from communal labor systems to deeply ingrained survival knowledge, passed orally across generations. The relentless winters of the Little Ice Age had, in effect, honed the peasant way of life into a discipline winters of medieval Europe. Survival demanded more than passive endurance. It required ingenuity, adaptation, and a keen understanding of the natural world. Peasants, with almost nothing in the way of resources, transformed their hardships into a complex set of strategies that balanced ingenuity, necessity, and communal effort. Every aspect of life, every brick of mud, every bundle of straw, every ember of fire was carefully optimized to prolong life in the face of temperatures that could freeze bones and shatter hope. These adaptations were not luxuries or conveniences. They were lifelines, the difference between survival and death, and they reveal a story of resilience that is often overlooked in the grand narratives of kings and empires. One of the most critical adaptations was the clever use of the earth itself. Floors, usually bare packed clay, were layered with straw or rushes, creating a buffer against the frozen ground. This simple practice reduced the transfer of cold from the earth into the living space, trapping small pockets of warmth from human activity and the central hearth. Walls, often thick with mud and clay, were packed carefully to retain heat. Even cracks were deliberately filled with moss, straw, or animal hair to prevent drafts. In many ways, the mud huts themselves were sophisticated instruments of thermal regulation. Earth, dense and capable of retaining warmth, was, in some respects, superior to the stone used in wealthier households, which could absorb heat during the day but radiated away during the long, frigid nights. Fuel scarcity forced peasant communities to innovate further. Firewood, essential to keeping frostbite at bay, was often limited, especially during years of crop failure or over-harvesting. Peasants turned to alternative sources of fuel, including dried dung and reeds, which burned longer and produced sustained heat when wood was unavailable. Every ember was precious, every flame tended with vigilance. Fires were carefully arranged to maximize the warmth distributed throughout the hut, often placed centrally so that the heat radiated outward in concentric circles, allowing the perimeter of the room to be warmer than it would be from mere body heat alone. The knowledge of how to manage a fire was critical. Too much fuel, and it would burn away too quickly. Too little, and frostbite became imminent. Communal living emerged not only from necessity, but as a strategy for survival. Extended families often shared a single hut, layering straw and hides to create sleeping platforms that trapped body heat. During the coldest months, even neighboring families might combine efforts, huddling together to preserve warmth during the dead of night. This was more than a pragmatic decision. It reinforced social cohesion and mutual dependence, ensuring that no one faced the winter alone. Shared suffering became a shared strength, and the rhythms of cooperation coordinated fire tending, rationing of food, and mutual protection against frost were crucial to endurance. Every act of communal living was a deliberate strategy, carefully honed by generations of trial and error. Cultural practices and traditions also became instruments of survival. Songs, tales, and rituals provided more than comfort. They were tools for endurance. Storytelling occupied long winter nights, keeping spirits engaged and offering practical knowledge through allegory and memory. Folk tales often contained lessons about resourcefulness, caution, and timing, preserving essential survival strategies in narrative form. Rituals tied to midwinter celebrations, whether religious or pagan in origin, marked time, coordinated communal effort, and reinforced social bonds that were vital for surviving extended periods of cold and scarcity. These cultural expressions were inseparable from the practical realities of winter survival, demonstrating that peasant ingenuity was as much social and psychological as it was architectural or technical. Architectural adaptations were equally impressive. Huts were constructed with consideration of prevailing winds and terrain. The entrances of many homes were deliberately positioned to minimize cold drafts, while thatched roofs were layered in dense, insulating patterns that retained heat. Roofs were often angled steeply to allow snow to slide off rather than accumulate and crush the structure. Some communities experimented with double walls or earthen mounds built against huts to create additional insulation. Even seemingly minor innovations such as small smoke holes to regulate ventilation without losing excessive heat were critical to survival. These structures, while crude in appearance, reflected sophisticated empirical knowledge passed down through generations. Food management was also a form of ingenuity. Beyond basic storage, peasants developed techniques to maximize nutrition and caloric efficiency during the long months of scarcity. Root vegetables, legumes, and preserved grains were carefully rotated to ensure freshness, while soups and stews were designed to stretch limited ingredients into nourishing meals. Communities developed strategies to hide food from both pests and neighbors, using insulated pits, secret storage areas under floors, and elevated platforms. Preservation techniques, such as smoking or fermenting, were refined over generations to ensure that even in the harshest winters, families could survive for months without fresh provisions. Peasant ingenuity extended to clothing and personal insulation. Layers of wool, fur, and linen were combined to maximize warmth, while allowing mobility, and sleeping arrangements were carefully planned to minimize exposure. Children were taught survival skills from an early age, learning how to maintain fires, manage food, and conserve heat through body positioning and communal sleeping strategies. Every aspect of daily life became an extension of survival strategy, and knowledge of these practices was as critical as any physical shelter. The use of alternative materials also highlights the resourcefulness of peasants. Animal hides were stretched across walls or floors to provide additional insulation. Straw and rushes were woven into bedding, wall linings, and even improvised clothing. Mud, carefully packed, could be repaired and reinforced each season, creating structures that improved over time. These adaptations demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of material properties, as well as the careful observation of natural cycles, which soils retained heat best, which straw resisted moisture, and which fuels burned most efficiently. Even in the bleakest winters, social cohesion and ingenuity often intersected with acts of altruism. Villages might pool resources to ensure that no household went entirely without firewood or food. Tasks were coordinated, from collecting dung for fuel to chopping straw for bedding, creating an intricate system of mutual reliance that increased the likelihood of collective survival. This social ingenuity cooperation as a survival mechanism, as important as any architectural or culinary innovation. The network of shared effort, embedded in ritual, tradition, and habit, became the unseen backbone of peasant endurance. Survival strategies were not uniform but adapted to regional climates and local resources. In colder, northern regions, mud walls were often thicker, thatch denser, and communal living more pronounced. In milder climates, huts might be smaller, with fewer layers of insulation but more reliance on crop storage and fire management. Even the landscape itself was a consideration. Villages were often sited on higher ground to avoid frost pockets in valleys, while orientation of huts minimized exposure to prevailing winds. These adaptations illustrate a dynamic relationship between environment, material culture, and human ingenuity, with every decision reflecting years of accumulated experience. The cultural dimension of winter survival further reinforced practical strategies. Music, dance, and oral storytelling were more than entertainment. They maintained morale, taught caution, and strengthened community bonds. Rituals surrounding the hearth, communal meals, and seasonal celebrations allowed peasants to coordinate labor and conserve resources effectively. Even in moments of festivity, practical concerns were embedded. Gatherings provided opportunities to redistribute food, repair shelters, and plan for the months ahead. In this way, culture and survival were inseparable, each reinforcing the other in a continuous cycle of adaptation. By the end of these long winters, every survival strategy, architectural, culinary, social, and cultural, intertwined into a complex system that allowed life to persist against relentless environmental pressure. The ingenuity of peasants transformed mud huts from fragile shelters into functional instruments of endurance. Every wall, every hearth, every ritual, every shared meal was a calculated response to the threat of cold and scarcity. The knowledge, accumulated over generations, became encoded in the very fabric of peasant life, shaping not only how communities endured winter, but also how they understood their relationship with the natural world. Even the humblest mud hut bore witness to extraordinary ingenuity. Earth walls that seemed crude were carefully designed to retain heat. Straw and dung served as insulation and fuel. Communal sleeping arrangements optimized warmth, and cultural practices sustained morale. The combined effect of these strategies allowed families to survive long winters when death lurked in every corner of their homes, fields, and forests. Each winter was a test, but But the ingenuity of peasants ensured that life endured where it might of medieval Europe's harshest winters. The impact of cold was intensified by the relentless scourge of human conflict. While kings and armies waged campaigns, peasants bore the brunt of suffering, trapped between the forces of nature and the machinery of war. Winter was no longer merely a test of endurance against frostbite. Starvation and disease became a crucible in which the cruelty of man compounded the cruelty of climate. Fields were left untended as peasants were conscripted or displaced. Huts were burned, and stored food was seized, leaving entire communities exposed to the biting cold with almost no resources. Survival was no longer a matter of strategy alone. It became a desperate contest of wit, secrecy, and sheer tenacity. When armies marched through the countryside, villages were often treated as both obstacles and resources. Mud huts, already fragile and scarcely warm, were stripped for fuel or torched entirely, the smoke and embers leaving families with nothing but the open sky above them. Timber, thatch, and stored grains were appropriated to feed soldiers, leaving peasants to scavenge for whatever could be hidden or salvaged. Children shivered while parents rationed what little food remained, often prioritizing their own survival over nourishment, forced into agonizing choices that no human should have to make. Famine, already a companion of winter, was now accelerated by the pressures of war, amplifying hunger into a near-constant, gnawing presence. Survival strategies evolved to meet these new threats. Caches of food were buried deep beneath frozen soil, hidden in fields, hollowed logs, or secret compartments within huts. Fires, once shared and communal, were now carefully controlled and concealed to avoid attracting marauding soldiers. Smoke signals, long a symbol of hearth and warmth, became dangerous indicators of life, potentially inviting plunder or violence. Peasants learned to move stealthily, to ration even more stringently, and to conceal every asset that might be exploited. Ingenuity became a lifeline, but the psychological toll was immense. The cold was no longer a solitary enemy, was compounded by fear of human violence, turning every winter into a landscape of terror as well as hardship. The winter campaigns of various medieval wars illustrate the vulnerability of peasant communities. From the 100 Years' War to localized feuds between neighboring lords, armies relied on requisitioning supplies from the countryside. Soldiers seized livestock, burned granaries, and appropriated firewood, leaving villagers to endure the snow and frost with nearly nothing. Historical chronicles from the period recount families surviving on roots, bark, and even the occasional hunting of small game, their huts reduced to embers or battered by wind and frost. Hunger and exposure became constant companions, often as deadly as the armies themselves. Peasant endurance in these winters of war was marked by ingenuity and subtle rebellion. The use of underground food stores, hidden fires, and communal sharing networks became more sophisticated than in peacetime. Villagers learned to navigate between survival and discretion, teaching children to forage discreetly, to maintain hidden reserves of grain, and to burn fires in ways that minimized visible smoke. These adaptations were not mere habit, were survival tactics honed under extreme duress, reflecting a profound understanding of both the natural and social threats that defined their lives. Yet the human cost was staggering. Families were torn apart by starvation, disease, and exposure. The cold, which had always tested peasant endurance, now interacted with the violence of man-made conflict to create a level of suffering that could not be fully mitigated by ingenuity alone. Death, whether from frostbite, hunger, or the consequences of war, was ever present. A reminder that survival required not only knowledge and resilience, but also luck and circumstance. Even as they endured, peasants adapted in ways that would echo for generations. Winter, labor, and survival skills became inseparable from the rhythms of village life. Children learned early to recognize threats, to conserve warmth, and to store resources for unpredictable winters. Communities developed protocols for pooling resources, creating hidden food reserves, and coordinating shared defense against marauding soldiers. In the crucible of winter and war, human resilience was refined, demonstrating that survival was as much a social and psychological endeavor as it was a physical one. While kings and generals wrote history in campaigns and battles, the story of the peasantry during these winters of war was quieter, measured in whispered strategies, buried caches, and families who clung to life against staggering odds. Their survival, when it occurred, was a testament not to the wealth or might of empires, but to the ingenuity, solidarity, and relentless endurance of ordinary people. Winter was no longer a solitary adversary, it was a compounded force, a collaboration between nature's fury and human cruelty. And yet, despite everything, life endured. One hidden ember, one rationed meal, one stubbornly packed the relentless winters and frequent wars. There were rare moments when nature, fortune, and careful preparation combined to offer peasants a fleeting taste of prosperity. In these rare good years, granaries overflowed with harvested grains, livestock survived the cold, and mud huts were patched and reinforced before the first snows arrived. These moments did not erase the hardships of past winters, nor did they guarantee future stability, but they allowed communities to experience a fragile sense of security and comfort, reminder that human life could endure and even flourish under the most challenging conditions. During these fortunate periods, midwinter celebrations took on particular significance. Feasts coinciding with Yule, Christmas, or local village gatherings offered warmth not only in body but in spirit. Even in the modest confines of mud huts, families could share food, song, and companionship, temporarily lifting the weight of cold and hunger from their shoulders. These gatherings were often communal, reflecting the deep interdependence of village life. The act of sharing a meal, lighting a fire, or singing a seasonal song reinforced social cohesion and collective resilience, reminding everyone that survival was a shared endeavor and that even in the harshest climates, hope could persist. Religious traditions played a central role in shaping peasant perceptions of winter. Cold and suffering were often interpreted as trials from God, and survival was framed as a blessing or a mark of divine favor. Prayer, ritual, and observance offered not only spiritual consolation but also practical guidance, as religious calendars dictated planting, harvesting, and preparation cycles. Temples, churches, and local shrines became focal points for communal organization, providing guidance, support, and, occasionally, relief in the form of grain distributions or charitable assistance. Faith intertwined with survival, offering both meaning and structure in a world allowed peasants to refine their shelters and expand their resources. Mud huts, usually patched hurriedly under the pressure of approaching frost, could be carefully repaired, insulated with additional straw, and reinforced against snow and wind. Fires could burn more freely, as fuel stores were replenished and rationing could be temporarily relaxed. Food reserves allowed for more varied and nutritious diets, reducing the constant gnawing of hunger that defined harsher years. Livestock, protected and well-fed, provided both sustenance and resources for warmth, such as hides and dung for fuel. Even small innovations or improvements in construction, fuel management, or food storage had a significant impact. Families could create layered bedding arrangements, line floors with fresh straw, and reinforce roofs and walls to withstand the coming winter. Tools and equipment, often neglected in harder years, could be repaired and maintained, ensuring that the machinery of subsistence, hoes, plows, grinding stones, remained functional. These periods of prosperity, though brief, were critical for ensuring that communities could endure subsequent winters, and they demonstrated the cumulative value of careful planning, foresight, and adaptation. Cultural expressions flourished. Alongside material improvements, music, dance, storytelling, and oral histories became more vibrant, reflecting not only the joys of survival, but also the lessons learned from hardship. Villagers used these periods of relative abundance to transmit knowledge, reinforce traditions, and strengthen communal bonds. Midwinter gatherings were thus both celebration and education, opportunities to share techniques for food storage, fire management, and structural maintenance, alongside songs and tales that preserved communal identity and reinforced the collective memory of survival. In addition, these periods offered psychological reprieve. The harsh winters had instilled a constant tension in daily life, a near-perpetual awareness of mortality. In rare, prosperous years, the temporary relief allowed families to experience hope, plan for the future, and cultivate a sense of control over their environment. The moral and spiritual framework within which peasants interpreted their world, surviving a winter with full granaries, patched huts, and adequate firewood, was framed as both divine favor and the result of prudent labor. Rituals of thanksgiving, whether informal ceremonies or simple household prayers, reinforced communal values and the idea that survival was not merely a matter of chance but of cooperation, diligence, and adherence to social and spiritual norms. Even mud huts, humble as they were, became focal points of community life in these periods. Their walls, patched and reinforced, held not only warmth but memories, knowledge, and identity. Families could store seeds and surplus food for future planting, teach children the skills necessary for survival, and engage in social activities that strengthened the cohesion of the village. In these fleeting winters of prosperity, the peasant world was transformed from a site of constant struggle into one of cautious optimism and measured abundance. Yet these moments were ephemeral, often punctuating centuries dominated by cold, famine, and war. They provided glimpses of what could be achieved when knowledge, preparation, and fortune aligned, but they were never permanent. The memory of hardship remained vivid, and every successful winter became a lesson in prudence, foresight, and the fragile balance of life. Even in celebration, peasants remained acutely aware of the risks ahead. a failed harvest, an approaching frost, or the arrival of soldiers could undo months of preparation in a matter of days. These rare glimpses of prosperity highlight the resilience, creativity, and communal spirit of peasant life. Even with minimal resources and simple structures, humans found ways to create meaning, foster hope, and endure. Feasts, religious observances, and community gatherings were more than cultural expressions. They were vital tools for survival, reinforcing the bonds that allowed families and villages to withstand centuries of cold, scarcity, and uncertainty. In essence, these moments reveal the dual nature of peasant existence, the harshness of winter and scarcity, and the persistent capacity for ingenuity, celebration, and endurance. Even in mud huts, surrounded by frost and snow, humanity found ways to sustain life, preserve knowledge, and create social structures capable of weathering both the cold and the trials of human cruelty. Prosperity, however brief, offered a testament to the potential for life to flourish against adversity, and it underscores the remarkable adaptability and resilience that defined peasant existence across centuries of industrialization. The world that had been dominated by mud huts for millennia began to transform across Europe. Advances in construction, technology, and material availability slowly displaced the wattle and daub huts that had been the backbone of peasant life. Stone, brick, and timber, once the domain of lords and wealthy townsfolk, became increasingly accessible to rural populations. Chimneys replaced open hearths, glass windows filtered the wind, and roofs were reinforced with durable materials that could withstand snow and rain far better than straw alone. The evolution of housing represented more than architectural progress. It marked a profound shift in the way ordinary people engaged with the natural world, asserting control over winter rather than merely enduring it. Yet even as industrialization marched forward, the mud hut did not vanish overnight. For millions of peasants in remote regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and parts of the Mediterranean, these simple structures remained the only shelter. Families continued to huddle in rooms barely larger than a modern living room, relying on straw, fire, and communal warmth to survive. In these regions, the rhythms of the agrarian year, the cycles of planting and harvest, and the brutal winters that had defined life for centuries persisted with remarkable continuity. The resilience cultivated over generations did not disappear. With new materials, it endured in habits, practices, and the collective memory of survival. The decline of the mud hut was as much cultural as it was structural. Generations of peasants had honed practices that ensured survival, layering floors with straw, insulating walls with mud and moss, rationing food with precision, and maintaining central hearths to maximize warmth. These practices, born from necessity, became embedded in the social fabric, rituals, and oral traditions of rural communities, even as brick and timber offered superior protection against the cold. The wisdom encoded in the mud walls' knowledge of rationing, heat management, and communal survival continued to inform daily life. In many ways, the transition to modern housing was not merely technological. It was a gradual cultural evolution, a slow rewriting of how humans responded to the harshness of winter. For historians and anthropologists, the persistence of mud huts into the 19th and 20th centuries offers a window into the continuity of human endurance. The physical structures themselves were humble, yet they bear witness to extraordinary adaptability. Inside these walls, families continued centuries-old traditions of heating, food preservation, and communal living. Generations of children learned to survive frost and famine not from books, but from observation and practice, inheriting knowledge that had been honed through millennia of trial and error. The peasant winter, harsh as it was, created a legacy of resilience and ingenuity that outlasted the physical mud huts themselves. The legacy of mud huts extends beyond practical survival. They are immortalized in folk tales, songs, and cultural memory, representing a life intimately tied to the rhythms of the earth, the changing seasons, and the relentlessness of nature. Tales of endurance, of families huddled in smoke-filled rooms while snow piled high outside, became allegories of human perseverance. Songs celebrating harvests, survival, and communal solidarity preserved these lessons in the fabric of cultural life. The mud hut, though humble, became a symbol of resilience, proof that ordinary people could survive conditions that kings and armies could scarcely endure. Industrialization accelerated the transformation of rural life, introducing tools, materials, and techniques that fundamentally changed how peasants confronted winter. Chimneys reduced smoke inhalation, more efficient hearths conserved fuel, and masonry structures protected against frost, snow, and flooding. The reliance on ingenuity over material became less critical, but the human capacity for adaptation cultivated over centuries in mud huts remained vital. Lessons learned in endurance, cooperation, and resourcefulness continued to inform peasant strategies in housing, agriculture, and community life. Even as the material world changed, the psychological and cultural legacies of survival persisted. For many rural communities, the shift from mud huts to insulated homes was gradual and uneven. Wealthier peasants often transitioned first, building stone or timber homes that offered improved protection and comfort. Meanwhile, poorer families continued in traditional huts, relying on the same strategies that had sustained their ancestors through centuries of harsh winters. This coexistence of old and new reflects the slow rhythm of historical change and the persistent relevance of adaptive practices developed under extreme conditions. In essence, the mud hut was not merely a building. It was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, a structure whose value extended far beyond its physical walls. The decline of the mud hut also reshaped social structures. Improved housing allowed families to store more food, preserve livestock more effectively, and maintain better overall health. These developments gradually increased life expectancy, reduced winter mortality, and facilitated the expansion of rural economies. Yet the wisdom accumulated over centuries in mud walls about rationing, fuel management, and communal support remained embedded in village life, shaping behaviors and attitudes toward survival. In many respects, the transition to modern housing was not a rejection of peasant ingenuity, but its extension, providing new tools to reinforce lessons learned in the crucible of frost, hunger, and adversity. Even in the modern era, the psychological imprint of centuries spent in mud huts lingers. Folk songs recounting frost and famine, oral histories of clever rationing or hidden caches, and cultural practices surrounding communal warmth continue to inform the identity of rural communities. The narrative of survival honed in smoke-filled, straw-lined mud huts. Echoes in contemporary practices, reminding successive generations that endurance, ingenuity, and cooperation were the foundations of human life long before industrial comforts. Ultimately, the story of mud huts is the story of the slow but inexorable evolution of human adaptation, from Neolithic villages to the harsh winters of the Little Ice Age, and finally to the gradual replacement by brick, stone, and timber. These structures encapsulate the human struggle against the cold, famine, and adversity. While industrialization transformed the physical landscape of housing, the legacy of endurance, resourcefulness, and social cohesion forged in mud huts persisted, shaping the resilience of ordinary people in ways that extended far beyond their humble walls. In the broader sweep of history, mud huts serve as a reminder that human survival is as much about ingenuity and community as it is about technology. They represent the foundation upon which rural life, agriculture, and eventually modern housing were built. The transition from mud walls to insulated homes reflects a journey spanning millennia. A journey that began with ordinary peasants huddled together for warmth, leveraging every scrap of earth, straw, and fire to endure the cold. The endurance, knowledge, and cultural memory cultivated in these structures formed the invisible scaffolding for future generations, proving that the human capacity to survive is both remarkable and enduring. The decline of the mud hut world is therefore not merely a story of architecture, but of human resilience. It marks the point where centuries of adaptation, endurance, and collective ingenuity began to converge with new technologies, offering comfort and security to millions who had previously relied solely on mud, straw, and communal knowledge. Yet even as the physical mud huts faded from the landscape, their lessons remained alive in cultural memory, practices, and the indomitable spirit of those who had endured countless winters. From humble beginnings in frost-ridden fields to insulated homes that could finally resist the cold, the legacy of the mud hut is a testament to the persistence of ordinary people who, against all odds, kept the flame of life alive through centuries of unrelenting winter. From the first farmers of the Neolithic to the starving peasants of the Little Ice Age, the story of mud huts is, at its core, the story of human endurance. Across millennia, empires rose and fell, kings came and went. Yet the peasant, in his humble shelter, endured winter after winter with nothing but mud, straw, and hope. Each frost-laden night tested their ingenuity. Every failed harvest demanded adaptation, and every communal fire became both a lifeline and a symbol of resilience. Through these challenges, ordinary people forged strategies, rituals, and cultural practices that ensured not only survival, but the preservation of knowledge and community across generations. The endurance of peasants in mud huts highlights a fundamental truth about humanity. The extraordinary strength often resides in the ordinary, in those whose struggles leave no monuments or chronicled victories. While kings wrote laws, generals waged wars, and empires sought conquest, the persistence of peasants ensured the continuity of life itself. The mud hut was a crucible in which survival, ingenuity, and social cohesion were tested and refined. Its walls, humble as they were, bore witness to countless stories of quiet heroism, of human life persisting where death seemed inevitable. and of culture flourishing amidst scarcity and cold.